Hey YouTube, Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. The withdrawal from Kabul. We're now a little past the 2-year anniversary of that decision by the Biden administration was one of the most controversial moments in U.S. foreign policy in recent years. We could even track the fact that the overall decline in the Biden administration's approval ratings to perfectly correlate with the problems that happened in August 2021. So on that anniversary, I've got two authors, Jerry Dunleavy and James Hasson, to discuss their new book, Kabul, where we're going to get into the debate over whether the withdrawal was always going to be botched, whether there were decisions the Biden administration could have made from a different perspective to make things better, and what the lessons are for the future. I hope you all enjoy this conversation. I would love to hear what you think, because honestly, I came into this question not really knowing what my specific perspective was. Jerry Dunleavy and James Hasson, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So I want to ask this first question as delicately as possible, because obviously we're talking about a story involving the deaths of 13 U.S. service members and, of course, hundreds of Afghan civilians. Beyond the human level of that story, why 2 years later is this a story, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, Kabul, one that Americans should engage with? I'm kind of thinking in the context of, if it's 1977, I doubt that many people were looking to go over the pullout from Saigon. So kind of answer it in that context.
Yeah, well, look, the war in Afghanistan was America's longest war, a 20-year war. More than 2,400 American service members were killed during that war. Tens of thousands of Afghans who were allied with us were killed during that war, and hundreds of members of NATO who went over there with us after 9/11 were killed in that war as well. So this is a 20-year war. We spent a lot of money there. We lost a lot of blood and treasure there. And obviously for the war to end this way, I think should give everyone a lot of pause. Our goal in writing this book was to expose the truth about what happened. Obviously 20 years of mistakes during, the course of the war under, 4 different presidents, but President Biden was the one who made a series of catastrophic and strategic decisions that led to the debacle in Afghanistan. And obviously 13 Americans, service members killed, dozens of them wounded, some of them very seriously with life-altering injuries as well. Female service member paralyzed, Sergeant Tyler Vargas Andrews losing 2 of his limbs. And so this did have, as you mentioned, the human element. But I also think that it had consequences that go beyond that. Obviously, 20 years now after the attacks of 9/11, you have pretty much the same people in the Taliban or their sons in charge now. And you've got Al-Qaeda. The alliance with Al-Qaeda remains unbroken. And in fact, members of the Taliban who are also members of Al-Qaeda are in the Taliban government now. And of course, as we lay out in our book, we also think that this debacle had consequences that rippled beyond just Afghanistan. Vladimir Putin obviously wanted to invade Ukraine for a long time. It was a long-term goal of his. But I think that the evidence that we gathered in the case that we lay out makes it pretty clear that the debacle in Afghanistan and the United States and NATO's 20-year war ending in such a disaster was likely the final push that Putin needed to invade. And obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues to this day. So lots of consequences from this. And obviously, it's important that this never happens again. And that's the purpose of the book.
Yeah, if I can piggyback off that just very briefly. One thing that we point out in the prologue of the book is that whether or not you think it was a good decision to withdraw, it was the fact that things, regardless of where you land on that decision, things didn't have to turn out the way that they did. I served in Afghanistan, so I am not, I pretty pro, time for them to stand on their own kind of approach to things. Because I saw what the war cost people. I saw it, lost, good friends. But what the way that it went down was so egregious, so humiliating, and lost American lives and ruined, or at least seriously damaged a lot of others. And to say nothing of the fact is that we left Americans behind. We abandoned Americans, and the government's job is to protect its citizens. So you could divorce this from a broader geopolitical context, which I think would be a mistake. But even if you did, the government knowingly left thousands of Americans behind. And it used to be that a blue passport, was the most valuable document in the world, because it meant that if you were overseas and some gang took you hostage, terrorist outfit, that the American government would be knocking on their door instantly. And here we had Taliban fighters beating up Americans in full view of, in full view of the world, to say nothing of the American troops who are on the wall and can do very little about it because they're pulled back. And then we left Americans behind, some of whom are still there and still stuck. And that's just from a moral perspective, an outrage.
Yeah, I like your use of the term or the word moral, because it gets to the broader context of how President Biden looks at this issue. So let's break the morality and obligations aspect of this into two parts. So one, in a dangerous situation, right? The evacuation of a country at the end of a military, trying to find the right euphemism because I don't want to say occupation. I don't want to, but at the end of like a military engagement, I sound so like, that's so like sterile, but it's, the end of our military engagement in Afghanistan. People know we're leaving. What is the obligation that the United States government has to American citizens, in the sense that if there are still 10 people left, does that mean that we need to extend the time that we're holding the airfield in Kabul? Like, how do you think of that dynamic? To whoever wants to take it first can go.
Yeah. I'll start, and then I'll let Jerry chime in. That's a great question, and I'm sure it's also one that people, generals were wrestling with, and all of that. And because there is a somewhat of a tension in what you just described, but the premise of the question was also that people knew that we were leaving. The administration failed so clearly to plan that everyone knew that the U.S. troops were drawing down, but we said, hey, we're still going to have an embassy. We're still going to, there's going to be a functioning and thriving Afghanistan with an Afghan military that can take care of itself. Then they, were shown to be just complete, wish casting. Basically, we misled all of these people who are still staying. And then all of a sudden, everything collapsed and the embassy's gone within a day. And there are no flights anymore. The airport's taken over. They can't get out. To say nothing of the fact that now there's a brutal, call what it is, like Stone Age terrorist group all of a sudden in charge. And you're leaving at the mercy of that. So, I understand there's always kind of the hypothetical of like what obligation do we have to rescue someone who hikes into,
Iran. This is literally
Iran,
happened.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Like I get those questions. I understand them. Here we did it on scale. We did it in front of everyone. It was thousands and thousands of people in a way that is completely corrosive to our credibility to do all kinds of things on the world stage. But more importantly, we did it. These people were there on the reliance of the American government, on the assurances, And then those assurances turned out to be completely false. And then we didn't help them. We just walked away.
How about you,
And,
Jerry?
to add to that, President Biden, even after the Taliban took over Afghanistan, President Biden promised that the U.S. Troops that he had to send back in would stay there until we got all Americans out. And of course, that ended up being yet another promise that he broke. And so, I obviously, I do believe that we had an obligation to make sure that Americans got out. It's an obligation that we failed on. And, part of why Americans had so much trouble getting out was once the Taliban took over. And, this all goes back to the fact that the United States pulled, in a very swift military retrograde, pulled all of our troops out before we had gotten Americans out. We shut down Bagram Air Base, which would have been a much safer place to run an evacuation out of, and would have been great to have to assist in any NEO as well, both in terms of helping get Americans out and helping keep the Taliban at bay to make sure that they didn't take Kabul. But that's exactly what happened. And so when we were trying to get American citizens out, the U.S. presence in Afghanistan had shrunk down to an airport. And everything outside the airport in that entire country was controlled by the Taliban. And so we were reliant on the Taliban to let Americans through. And, a decent number of Americans did manage to get through the gauntlet. And it was a gauntlet. I mean, it was tough. And the Taliban was rough, and the Taliban was beating people.
American women especially. Those are a favorite target for them.
Yeah. But some Americans were just turned away from the Taliban and were unable to get out. And so that just goes to show the problems with relying on the Taliban. And since you brought up the question of moral obligation and our moral obligation when it comes to wars, I want to touch on briefly the Afghan allies that we left behind as well. President Biden, he was elected to the Senate in the 1970s, and his first big attempt to make a name for himself as an American politician was during the close of the Vietnam War. He was elected to the Senate pretty much too late to become a big part of the anti-war, leader movement there. So how he tried to make his mark on the war in Vietnam was he was the leading voice in American politics to fight efforts from Gerald Ford and others to help get the South Vietnamese who had helped America during that war to help them get out. Joe Biden did everything that he could to stop that from happening. And, you brought up moral obligation. There's actually a famous quote from him that I dug up from the Senate archives where he said that, we have no obligation to 1,001 South Vietnamese, no obligation to any of them. Okay. And so that is a mindset that he had as a 30-something guy in the war in Vietnam, and it's the mindset that he had during the war in Afghanistan as well. He really did not care very much about the Afghans that had fought beside us. And so once this debacle happened because of Joe Biden's orders, not only did Americans get killed and Afghans get killed, but Americans were left behind and tens of thousands of Afghan allies were left behind as well.
That's really interesting, and I'm glad you took it there. And this is where, I was going to have a question I was going to ask you, like, what are your connections to the war in Afghanistan? James, you obviously answered that to a degree, and my perspective of this is always going to be the fact that I was in fourth grade when 9/11 happened, so I was just young enough to be able to understand what was happening. I was at the White House the day that we found out that Osama bin Laden was killed, so that really bookended my early childhood. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that for most Americans, we were in Afghanistan to get Osama bin Laden, defeat Al-Qaeda, punish after 9/11. So that's why the conversation point around to what degree do we owe Afghan allies? To what degree do we owe like women in Afghanistan? There's a Joe Biden quote that you also feature in the book where Joe Biden is very explicitly articulating that it's not the responsibility of him to send his then living son, Beau Biden, who's in the U.S. Army, to Afghanistan to defend women's rights. That's a position that I actually suspect a more than decent percentage of Americans across the political spectrum, whether or not they would reveal that in a poll, would be, let's say, sympathetic to. So how should we unpack what we sign up for when we engage in foreign interventions?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. And to kind of add a little bit more meat on the bones in terms of kind of the context you just described, we did kill bin Laden in 2011, and warfare has changed immensely in the 20 years since we first went into Afghanistan. We didn't have armed Predator drones in 2001, and a whole lot of other things have changed. So there's absolutely I think like a good argument to be made, and I honestly was making it myself in 2017, 2019, that what we were doing wasn't effective, and our at some point the country has to stand on its own. And so I'm not going to sit here and pretend that if we had just spent 10 more years we could have turned Afghanistan into the modern iteration of ancient Greece.
Or even Japan and Germany after World War II, right? You don't need not to be poetic. It's just, that's the kind of the model, the assumption.
Yeah. And having been there, I've seen that firsthand. But that's kind of the point of the book, in that we don't take a strong position on that in particular because we don't have to. Our point is that if you're going to withdraw from a country, doing it the way that they did now maximized the chances that Americans would be stranded, that the Taliban would take over, which is objectively a bad thing, regardless of whether you think American troops should be the ones preventing it or Afghans, is objectively a very, very bad thing. And maximize the chances that, there's going to be all kinds of other follow-on disruptions from, in the world stage, which includes now China taking a very active role in Afghanistan and, mining all of the natural resources they have, but also all of the human information that they have about how American soldiers fight, how American units fight. And Iran's doing the exact same thing. They've been actively trying to recruit the Afghan Special Forces commandos to learn everything they can about how we plan missions, how we do, how our tactics work, everything. And that, at the end of the day, puts American troops wherever they are in the world at risk, but it's undermines the global stability that, is, at least if you're looking from American perspective, is in everyone's interest. But so, yeah, I guess the point is we don't take a position on that, because what happened, no matter how you come down on it, was unforgivable. It was weak, and it was shameful, and ultimately Americans died. And go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, I mean, what I would add to that is, President Biden refused to be honest on this issue, because we could have had an honest debate about what staying or leaving looks like, and what keeping a small troop presence there while attempting to enable the Afghans to keep fighting and keep the Taliban at bay, what that all looks like. But we didn't have an honest debate about this. When President Biden announced his troop withdrawal, he claimed that Al-Qaeda was gone from Afghanistan. A total lie. Al-Qaeda remains.
And quick pause, because I want to be very precise. In this context, lie means something. So you're saying, like, not just colloquially, but that was a lie. Like, we knew they were there, and he claimed that they weren't there.
Yeah, and Biden claimed this a few times, and it's just not true. And it was a knowable fact that Al Qaeda remained in Afghanistan. I mean, the U.S. and Afghan forces were still killing members of Al Qaeda right before Biden's announcement and right after. I mean, Al Qaeda was still in Afghanistan, but Biden was trying to say uh, that it wasn't. And it's something that he also said after the Taliban took over as well. And was never true. Another thing that he said was, and why this was all set up for such failure, is a constant mantra from him and from other people in his national security team, was that the Afghans had a 300,000 person strong military. And so therefore they were going to be able to fight and defeat the Taliban. This 300,000 military figure is just completely untrue and was known to be completely untrue at the time. Now, there's two reasons why. First is the 300,000 troops was combining the size of the Afghan military and then the size of like the Afghan police and paramilitary together, which we never do with any other country to get to how big is your military.
Mm-hmm.
But we were doing that with the Afghans. We were inflating the size of the Afghan military on that element to, I don't know what, to fool ourselves into thinking that the Afghan military was stronger, to fool the American public. I'm not entirely sure. And beyond that sort of misleading math, it was also well known that the Afghan military had what are called ghost soldiers, which are just people that exist on paper but weren't really there. Plus, the Afghan military was in the midst of basically a massive onslaught by the Taliban that continued throughout the spring and the summer. And even as the Afghan military was disintegrating, literally falling apart, we continued to promote this 300,000 figure. So my point with this, and I could go on and on and on about it, is that if we wanted to have an honest discussion about what a withdrawal would look like, we should have done that. And maybe but the problem is that we didn't have an honest discussion. And just one more point is that strategically, in terms of when we withdrew, we had been fighting in Afghanistan for 20 years. We know about the Afghan fighting season. We know when fighting is brutal there. And we know when fighting basically stalls out because of the brutal winters in the mountain terrain. Joe Biden decided, because I guess he wanted some sort of victory lap related to the
Heidi narrative, just like 20 years,
Yeah, the 9/11 date. Yeah.
And he wanted to mark the 20th anniversary by, having that be the date that we were out of Afghanistan. But the problem with that is that our entire retrograde from April through about July, when it wrapped up, we were pulling U.S. troops out at the exact same time that the Afghan fighting season was ramping up. And so right as we were pulling U.S. troops, contractors, logistics, intelligence, all of these supports that the Afghan military had, that is the exact moment when the Taliban onslaught was kicking off. And so we, just by picking the date that we did, and by we, I mean President Biden, just by doing that, we helped set things up for failure. And there are so many different things like that we lay out in the book about all of the little decisions that could have been done differently that we didn't, and just set this up to be a disaster.
Well, and let me just add one very small point to that. To Jerry's point about this just not being an honest and upfront discussion, we spoke to people in the intelligence community who told us that their internal assessments for when Afghanistan would collapse once we withdrew any enabling support, in the form of drones or contractors or anything, of that variety, where it was, some of the most optimistic assessments were 6 months, and the least were, almost immediately, which is exactly what we saw, almost immediately. But if that had been what was presented to the American people, to circle back to your initial question about what do we owe the American citizens that were stranded there, well, they would have been, out. They would have left. And it would have been a different choice presented to the American people than the way it was sold. And now, that we have, Gold Star families still looking for answers, and soldiers, permanently disabled, including paralyzed. Now that's, they're trying to just ignore it and pretend that this was all inevitable when it wasn't. And so I think that's part of the motivation for what we're doing.
And James, if you've read your book, what you just articulated, combining these two statements together, is really fascinating, because the answer, I'll guess, for why there wasn't an honest articulation of the timeline come April, May, was that would have all of the semblance of a political defeat. Hey, we claimed for the past 20 years that this military is functional. It's not functional. B, this is an emergency. We need to move. Like, that's not, if you're trying to do this 20-year 9/11 narrative, that is just not what you would embrace. So here's where this gets awkward, though, and where I think my frustration with President Biden comes about. If you read the statements that you all reproduce in the book, him in 2009, him in 2010, 2011, 2015, aside from his opposition to the bin Laden raid, because of course you guys have to include the Robert M. Gates quote, former Secretary of Defense under Bush and Obama, where he says Joe Biden's been wrong in every single foreign policy decision in his career. Let's put the opposition to the bin Laden raid in the wrong category. His political analysis is actually, I think, pretty prescient, in the sense that, like, hey, like, there actually isn't a political consensus in favor of the moralistic claims about women's rights. Actually, the Democratic side of this debate isn't as secure as you think it is, and you need to bring in the political aspect. Why do we see kind of the gap of political awareness between then and then that April, May, June period? Maybe this is just incorrect, but just thinking out loud, I'm like, there's a real gap there in understanding how that he seems to have gone from deeply realist in 2010 to very sort of hand wavy in 2021.
Let me take a stab at that. So, look, it's tough for me to get into the mind of President Biden, but my basic assessment is that I really think that that Biden felt very, very ignored, especially on the issue of Afghanistan, when he was President Obama's vice president, and he became just convinced that this is what we were going to do, and consequences be damned. I think he had a real chip on his shoulder when it came to military generals as well. He felt very much ignored by them during his time in the Obama White House as well. And so when military leaders were telling him, hey, if you pull U.S. troops out immediately, this is gonna fall apart real fast, he just wasn't particularly concerned about it. I think he had long ago washed his hands of Afghanistan. And I don't want to put the human rights and women's rights issues aside, but in addition to those, the bigger strategic question, I think, is do we want the Taliban back in charge of Afghanistan? And do we want the Taliban back in charge of Afghanistan on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which is exactly what ended up happening because of his withdrawal announcement and because of his deadline of 9/11. And those things happening were obviously not good. But there's questions now about President Biden's age and his ability to do the job energetically. But from what we found for our book, while there is a lot of truth to that, this decision on Afghanistan was Biden and pretty much Biden alone. This was driven by President Biden, with some weak opposition from some people, some somewhat stronger opposition from others. But President Biden was driving the discussion on this, and it was his decision, start to finish.
Yeah, and just quick thing. Thank you for noting that, because I get particularly aggravated when you kind of have the conspiracy adjacent thought that, oh, Joe Biden isn't in control, he's not making decisions. If you study the story, this is very specifically Joe Biden leading, what for good or for ill, leading, directing, etc. But yeah, James, do you want to add anything to that?
Oh, I was just going to say that's exactly to agree to your point that this is what Joe Biden has always believed. So, you don't need to go down some rabbit hole about, who's in charge or who's not. It's very clear. This is unfortunately vintage Joe Biden and what Joe Biden still believes.
So 2 or 3 last strategic questions before we get into the tactical. So I know for a fact that listeners who are deeply sympathetic to the objective of getting out of Afghanistan, their initial pushback to everything you're saying, to the book, et cetera, is going to be, that's all fine and good. That's fair if we're going down the list. But at the end of the day, the U.S. presence in Afghanistan was doomed in the same way that Vietnam was doomed. And we could say, well, if you did this thing in 1972 or this thing in 1969 or this thing in 2011 or this thing in 2005, this at its core, this military engagement was so flawed past a certain point that we always were going to have a messy withdrawal. Maybe that would be messy in a different direction than one other direction. Maybe this thing could have been done differently. What are your responses to that argument? Because these people tend to acknowledge every single thing you've said. They'll say, yes, like going down the list, like that was a mistake, this was a mistake, Bagram closure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we were always going to have the helicopters off the rooftop of the embassy, and we were always going to have a suicide bomb to close out the occupation.
Yeah, and what I would say to that is that's simply just not the case. In that, again, I was sympathetic to the idea of eventually withdrawing all troops. The way to do it, though, would have been to keep Bagram, which has, it's a full service, airport, or at least was, that could do a whole lot of, flights in and out every single day, rather than, and it was completely defensible, rather than a, single strip, runway with dual purposes in the middle of a dense population center. And there was a meme that intelligence officers and military folks were sharing with each other when they were closing up Bagram. That kind of just gets to the heart of it a little bit. So that and it was a picture of the Sun Tzu, and then it said, always give up your most strategic airspace when you're when you're evacuating a country. It makes no sense. And what would Afghanistan as a country, would that the military have held on? As we just discussed, probably not.
Actually, let's pause there then. Why did they give up Bagram? We've just taken that as why did they give it up?
We get into that quite a bit, and Bagram has been a pet project of Jerry's for some time, so I'll let him handle this one. But thank you. That's a great question.
Yeah. So I'll just preface this part with, currently I am an investigator for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and my job is focusing on the Afghanistan withdrawal. But these comments are all like in my personal capacity. But what I can say is that the committee brought in the command sergeant major for closing down Bagram in July 2021. His name is Jake Smith, and he testified last month about this. And he said that he was there in Afghanistan in 2021, and the State Department State Department survey site team came from the Kabul embassy to Bagram in early 2021, and he told them, if you're going to do a NEO, you would be absolutely insane to try to do it.
NEO being a non.
I'm using nomenclature, but
yeah, thank you. I obviously the Matrix just flashed before my eyes. I was like, is that like a Matrix reference? So, but yeah, sorry, go on.
I see. I'm already slipping into congressional jargon, but so a NEO is a non-combatant evacuation operation, basically an evacuation, right? And this command sergeant major told the State Department, if you're going to do an evacuation like this, you'd be insane to do it out of Kabul airport. You have to do it through Bagram. And, we apparently had a many years old evacuation plan through Bagram that the command sergeant major had. And he said, he looked at the plan, and the plan was for something like evacuating like 60 or 80,000 people. And he's like, that would be insane to try to do through Kabul airport. And the State Department said, yeah, we agree that would not be a good idea. And also, by the way, we think that an evacuation, the number would have to be something more like 140,000. And the command sergeant major is like, well, you definitely can't do that through just Kabul airport. I mean, now you really need Bagram. And so it was clear from the people on the ground that trying to do a massive evacuation through Kabul airport, it would be problematic under normal circumstances. Doing it with the Taliban in charge of every inch of Afghanistan outside of that little airport was completely insane. Now, where does the decision ultimately land? It's a very good question. President Biden had limited the number of U.S. troops that were allowed to be in Afghanistan. And, military leaders like McKenzie, Milley, Miller, we're all discussing this. And basically their assessment, so they testified, is that the limitation on troop numbers that President Biden had put and the goals that he had of maintaining the U.S. Embassy and Kabul airport, the troop cap combined with the goals that Biden had set meant the U.S. military would have been stretched too thin to control Bagram. Now, why they didn't push back further, knowing that getting rid of Bagram would be a complete disaster, because that's exactly what happened, I couldn't tell you yet. But there are a lot of questions that remain about why we abandoned Bagram. But obviously, everybody knew, including all of the people on the ground, that it was a terrible idea.
So, Jerry, follow up, and James, you could obviously jump in on this too, but this is where this story gets particularly awkward in terms of the Taliban, right? Because obviously we're not allied with the Taliban. Like, that's not like a great situation on 15 different levels, to put it not that eloquently. But during the withdrawal, we obviously cooperated with the Taliban, and the suicide bombing was done by ISIS, who are in their own like weird little like civil war with the Taliban. So like it was kind of a weird circumstantial reality. What leeway did we have with the Taliban in order to basically say, look, we're getting out, you guys have won? Was there a world where they let us basically do what we did, but with the expanded part of Bagram? Do you kind of get what I mean? So like, if we're looking at like the scope of political possibility, where the Taliban are effectively, once again, they weren't effective, right? Like I'm not pretending they made it easy, but they effectively they weren't shooting at us, right? Like they weren't doing the suicide bombing. How big were the possibilities that we could have worked with come August?
Okay. Yeah. Come August, I think is a good way to frame it, because if we had kept Bagram, they would not have been able to take Kabul. I mean,
so I wasn't alleged. Okay, that's helpful to know. So it's not so let me restate then. So it's not simply that in August they've taken over the whole country, but we ideally have Bagram and Kabul airport. You're saying that even if we'd retained Bagram, they wouldn't have taken the whole country.
Yeah. If we had retained Bagram until we completed a full evacuation and withdrawal, then basically there would have been some radius around which our control was definitely limited in that area. But Bagram is too defensible, and it is relatively close in proximity to Kabul, and we would have had more air assets there to continue kind of keeping that perimeter at bay. And then, at some point you bring all Americans from Kabul to Bagram, and then you leave. And Bagram was built by the Soviets. It's almost every American who's gone to Afghanistan has gone through that airfield. It is impenetrable. If it's kind of almost like the size of a small city. Mm-hmm. So we never had to get to that kind of, oh, do we need to, cooperate with the Taliban mentality in the first place. Jerry, I'm sure, is about to tell you about why even then we didn't have to allow them to have security of the airfield. And it was something, I won't preview it, but he's going to explain why it doesn't apply there either. So at that, that's one of the things that, we mean when we say it just didn't have to be the way that it was. And the only reason that they, ended up closing down Bagram is that the administration had a political cap on the number of soldiers that they were going to say were in the country, and they needed it to be less than 1,000. And you can't hold Bagram with under 1,000 troops. You need 3 or 4 or 5, and so that meant because we needed to be under 1,000, then we had to get rid of Bagram, and that's why it happened. And Jerry referenced the old withdrawal plan. Believe it or not, that was President Obama's administration. And they looked at the feasibility of doing it, of closing down Bagram and doing it without Bagram and out of Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul. And they concluded it would be an absolute disaster if they tried to do that. And hence they, even in their planning purposes, they never planned for that. So that just to show you the magnitude of incompetence that we're dealing with. But I'll kick it to Jerry.
Yeah. I mean, another thing to keep in mind is that General McKenzie flew out to Doha around August 14th, August 15th, right around when the Taliban was surrounding Kabul. And he flew to Doha and he met with a top Taliban leader named Baradar. And McKenzie's intel at the moment was pretty outdated because McKenzie showed up with a map that had a circular perimeter around the area around Kabul, and he basically told Baradar, Taliban's not allowed to come inside this perimeter. And Baradar basically told him, well, we're already inside that perimeter. We're closing in on Kabul, actually. But Baradar, actually, this Taliban leader, offered McKenzie, said, if the United States wants to provide security in Kabul, we will let you. We'll let you do that to do your evacuation and leave. And McKenzie turned it down. Whether that request ever made its way all the way to President Biden remains to be seen. But the long and short of it is that McKenzie turned that offer down. And so
I would pause you there just to understand the story properly.
Yeah.
If the issue, to James's point, was that we didn't have the troop presence to maintain security in Bagram, would the McKenzie argument be that we did not have the troop presence in the context of the Afghan government collapse to maintain security without Taliban assistance? Would that be the argument?
Okay, so let me try and put this in better context. So we have like what Biden how Biden wanted things to play out, how he wanted things to play out is he set a full troop withdrawal by September 11th. He announced that in April. Almost all U.S. troops were out of Afghanistan by July 2021. We shut down all of our bases. We shut down Bagram on July 2nd. We were pretty much gone outside of very, very small troop contingent in Kabul itself to help protect the embassy and Kabul airport. And in this fantasy world that President Biden had generated, that is kind of how things would go. And if we need to do a NEO, we'll get around to it. And we're going to start to get Afghan allies out slowly. And maybe we'll get some Americans out here and there. And things are all just going to kind of go along. Well, everything changes because the Taliban is taking the country over. And the Biden administration somehow doesn't see it coming, despite the Afghan military falling apart, the rural areas collapsing, deals getting cut with the Taliban, the Afghan forces falling back, Taliban taking provinces, and the Taliban starts to take Afghan provincial capitals, because it had been surrounding these capitals for months and months, starts to take them in very, very rapid succession in August. And August 14th, basically almost every single capital in Afghanistan, a capital city in Afghanistan, had been taken. The Taliban is surrounding Kabul. This troop cap limit that we had set, this arbitrary, we need to keep the troops under, that is going to go out the window, because to do an evacuation, we need to pour thousands and thousands of U.S. troops in, which is what we do. The U.S. troop number that ended up having to go just into Kabul airport ends up being higher than U.S. troop levels had been for a couple of years. So this whole arbitrary troop level thing goes out the window when we need to do an evacuation anyway. And so we ended up sending thousands and thousands of U.S. troops back into Kabul anyway. And if you'll let me, I'd love to also touch on sort of this question of the Taliban and ISIS-K being mortal enemies. And like, if you have a specific interest in that, I'd love to run you through.
It's your show. Go for it.
It's much more complicated, I think. The ISIS-K and the Taliban fought each other a lot in Afghanistan, but it's Afghanistan. And so things are always a little bit more complicated than that. These groups do want different goals. The Taliban wants an Islamic emirate in Afghanistan. The ISIS-K wants a caliphate, a global caliphate. This is what they. So there are big differences, but for many years, the Taliban and ISIS-K obviously had common enemies. Those common enemies being the Afghan Republic and American and NATO forces. And so there is a lot of evidence that the Haqqani network element of the Taliban did a lot of collaboration with ISIS-K in carrying out attacks, especially in Kabul itself over the years. The Haqqani network facilitated ISIS-K attacks. It maybe even conducted some attacks itself that it allowed ISIS-K to take credit for. But the point is that the Taliban was more than happy to help ISIS-K in certain situations with killing Afghans and with killing Americans, because that was a common goal. It shakes faith in the Afghan government's ability to provide security for the rest of the country. And, the more Americans that you kill, obviously, you shake the desire of America to stick around. And so, yeah,
they may hate each other, but they hate us more.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. They hate each other, but they hate us more. So there were times where the Taliban and ISIS-K were fighting each other, where Taliban was fighting us, where ISIS-K was fighting us, and where the Taliban was helping ISIS-K carry out attacks at us all at once in Afghanistan. And that's what we try and kind of bring out in the book, is that you need to understand the U.S., I don't think, ever properly understood Afghanistan. And I don't think that President Biden understood these dynamics very well. And so when President Biden was saying, yes, ISIS-K is threatening Kabul airport, but the Taliban and ISIS-K are mortal enemies, and so we can rely on the Taliban to provide security. They are mortal enemies, but they're also have a history, especially in Kabul, of working together to carry out attacks against the United States.
Yeah, so two last big questions. So other obvious question to ask you is the Trump administration, parts of the Trump administration, and President Trump specifically wanted to leave Afghanistan, which is also another defense of the Biden administration that folks across the aisle will basically offer. Was, yes, it was messy, but at least he actually did it. Do you feel as if a Trump withdrawal, because it's the Trump era, so everything was chaos? What is your just sort of assessment of how that would have compared to what happened under Biden?
I mean, that's
take that. Yeah,
that's a tough hypothetical. I mean, I don't know how President Trump would have done this. I mean, our book is very honest about our assessment of the Doha agreement that Trump struck with the Taliban. a flawed agreement, but it had conditions, right? There were, I mean, flawed might be an understatement, deeply flawed agreement, but it did have conditions that the Taliban was supposed to meet. And, one of those conditions was ensuring that Al-Qaeda wasn't going to be a threat to the United States or the West, which obviously the Taliban Al-Qaeda alliance was never broken. And Al-Qaeda obviously has never ceased its desire to carry out attacks against the West and the United States. So that condition alone, and there were a number of conditions that the Taliban never met, but that condition alone, clearly was never met. There was movement at the end of the Trump administration where Trump clearly flirted with quickly pulling all of the U.S. troops out, but he ultimately didn't. And about in this sort of floating range between about 2,500 and 3,500 was what Trump left in Afghanistan. And if you talk to different people in the Trump administration, you might actually get different answers about what Trump's long-term solution was, whether he was going to immediately go to zero like Biden did, which would have, if he had made all of the same mistakes that Biden did, would have ended in similar disaster, or maybe he would have done something else. It's tough for me to weigh in on that hypothetical, but we kind of lay out in very detailed fashion that not only was the decision and the timing flawed, but every decision that President Biden made along the way was flawed. Not properly planning for an evacuation, having no real plan about how to get Americans and Afghans out, shuttering Bagram, the absolute swiftness of the retrograde, not even trying to keep
going down the end.
Yeah, not even trying to keep the Afghan military in the field, to keep the Taliban at bay for the amount of time that we would need them to conduct an evacuation. I mean, these basic things weren't done. And I think James has more to say about that.
Yeah. Just to add, one more example. Jerry talks about failures along the way. They didn't even start reducing personnel from the embassy until a week or two before everything went. And even then, you still had 3 diplomats for every soldier on the ground. It was the largest embassy, United States embassy in the world. And they didn't start burning documents. They didn't do any of that. So just the and they shut, what's interesting is they shut down the embassy and stopped processing anything for a period, I believe, like 4 weeks, might be 6 weeks in the summer before the evacuation because of some COVID cases. And so, there are just a million and one different ways that things could have been done differently, and they just weren't.
So
the total lack of urgency in an extremely urgent situation. I mean, I don't know how else to put it, that the country was collapsing for months, right in front of our eyes, and there was a total lack of urgency to do anything to start the process of getting Afghan allies out, to get Americans out, to do the things that would have need to be done to at least stall this for a few months, to give us the time that we needed to get people out. Total lack of urgency. And the Biden administration was still holding like National Security Council meetings on like, what should our evacuation plan look like the day before the Taliban took Kabul. I mean, this is like the level of just willful blindness that they had.
And just to close, right, because you guys are a little older than me, but we're part of the same broad generational cohort. I think the way you set up the start of the book by focusing on the withdrawal from South Vietnam really illustrates that, 30, 40 years from now, I think that this story and like where people in our cohort were based is going to play a role in whatever future conflict there is. So what would you just say is the broad generational like takeaway, right? Like our generation, we didn't start the war. We weren't there for those like early, like it's 2002. Are we going to go long-term on decisions? We were definitely there at the end, once again, much like Joe Biden in 1974, 75. So what's the generational takeaway here?
I think it's that America has an obligation to protect its citizens and to you know, if we're talking about the whole war, then I would say the generational takeaway is, if we go into a war, that we should be prepared to win it. We should have very clearly defined aims, and our leaders need to be straightforward and honest with the American people about the trade-offs of the decisions they're making. You could, make the case that for many years we had different leaders, pretend that success in Afghanistan and turning into Japan or Germany was just around the corner, and that wasn't true. But in this book, what we detail at length is that the Biden administration was not being honest about what would happen if it made the decisions that it did, and then you have 13 flag draped coffins because of it.
And to add to that, the generational takeaway for me is that I was a freshman in high school on 9/11, and so 20 years of war, and I try to point this out in the book. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan after 9/11 because the Taliban was harboring and sheltering Osama bin Laden, and they refused to turn him over. And so there you go. And did the United States turn its attention away from Afghanistan to Iraq? Yes. Did we make a series of mistakes for 20 years? We absolutely did. But so I sort of have a somewhat grim takeaway. Obviously, I think that the 2,400 American service members who lost their lives over the 20-year war, they're heroes. They were fighting a vicious terrorist group, Al Qaeda, that struck us on 9/11. They were fighting the group, the Taliban, that harbored that group and continues to harbor and ally with that group. The grim reality is that 20 years later, pretty much the same Taliban leaders or their sons are in charge, and it's not good. And I think that President Biden should have been more honest about what the consequences of withdrawal would have looked like, because consequences aren't good. And hey, maybe people would have wanted to leave anyway, even if it meant the Taliban back in charge. That's a decision for the American public. But the consequences are pretty bad, and pretty deadly. And when we do a war like this, I think that we have an obligation to the American service members to protect them, to honor them and their families when they lose their lives overseas, to help them when they come home. And I think that we also have an obligation to the locals who help us in these wars. A lot of Afghans stuck their necks out for America over 20 years. A lot of interpreters, they're helping American forces and putting their own lives in danger. And a lot of those people, thousands and tens of thousands of them, are still stuck now under Taliban rule.
Very well stated. Guys, this has been a really helpful conversation, kind of making clear why this isn't just like a, Monday morning quarterback situation. Like, there are some actual very straightforward things that were screwed up and how this is going to matter for the future. The book is Kabul, the Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco and the American Warriors Who Fought to the End. Jerry and James, thank you for joining me on The Realignment.
Hey, thank you very much.
Thanks, man. It was great.